Hi there, my name is Johnny Meatsack. Like you, I once held a normal life in a normal place with a normal job. I had a normal family. Hi, Karen. And simply thought I'd live my normal life to a normal death. One day, however, I experienced this thing called Gnosis. A direct revelation of a truer but distant reality, and the realization that my reality was a fabricated construct. I discovered my life was a lie and my identity was as synthetic as Alexa or Siri. And that the universe itself was a penitentiary built by cosmic overlords to trap and feed off my dormant, authentic consciousness. Jiminy crickets, I thought. My only choices were to join an awareness-killing cult like a political party or just kill myself. But by some luck or providence, Sophia's grace, I discovered Aeon Byte Gnostic Radio. Despite the host's creepy monologues and the show's blasphemous topics, I was able to develop the ability to uncover my authentic consciousness and deal with this prison planet. In other words, this gnosis grew until I was a fully divine being, no longer in the thrall of entities called archons and their soul-numbing, amnesia-causing powers. Thank you, Aeon Byte, for waking me up to my true eternal nature. Everything is still normal these days, except me, Johnny Meatsack. I'm on the adventure of many lifetimes to be completely liberated from the Black Iron Prison. Welcome, everybody. Welcome you, Johnny Meatsacks, attempting to break out of the Black Iron Prison per the intro video. If you are watching on video, my name is Miguel Connor, your Pompatus of Gnosis. And so glad to see everybody, as I see already people lining in into the chat room. We've got, especially those of you who can escape the stranded planes in New York or the Canadian smoke that has now come to the Midwest. Yes, we've had 2 days of horrible haze. I've not seen the sunlight, and the moon looks like a scrambled omelet. So strange times. But if you are here, and regardless if you are celebrating the 4th of July, Independence Day holiday weekend or whatever, please welcome everybody. I'm very excited. I recently returning from the Astronosis 2 conference. Huge success. Amazing things happen, and I will share as the time goes by. But with us, very excited to have back an individual who I do agree politically and spiritually. We had a great talk last August on conspiracy theories, David Icke, Philip K. Dick, and all that. I'm sure our guest agrees with Jimmy Dore when he says conspiracy theories should be just renamed into spoiler alerts, because it's just all of this is coming true. But that is Richard Cox. Richard, thank you very much for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me back. Thank you.
Wonderful. And we will be discussing your 2 books, which I've read. They're short but powerful books, Mandating Mandates and The Essence of Anarchy. And with us, too, we've got the Moondog Vance. Vance, how are you doing?
I'm just fine this morning. Also want to extend a welcome to all the Johnny vegetable sacks and all the Johnny mineral sacks out there. So get them all covered.
Yeah, I can't include the vegans. They'll get offended. So yes, all you Johnnies, no matter what, but you're still trapped in the hologram. So whatever.
And Johnny Quark sacks too.
Awesome. Yeah, not much housekeeping as always. If you have any questions, please super chat them so we can get to them. You can do it as low as $1 or less. That way we can keep it organized as the audience has grown in the chats. As always, if you please subscribe and like if you are here, it does help promote the show. Yeah, and support the show in any way you can. Great shows in July, so get ready on all different topics, including the Tarot, connecting quantum physics and Gnosticism, a few Finding Hermes on mental development and health, and a whole bunch, and so much more. You're going to be very impressed, as always, as summer heats up. Other than that, I think that's all I got. So, Richard, tell us a little bit. Well, actually, I wanted to ask you questions. We did an interview in August. I think I looked August 22nd. I swear time is completely warped because it seemed like forever. And I remember yesterday I talked to a friend and I hadn't talked to her in a month. And it felt like it had been 6 months since I talked to her. Do you feel time is a little twisted, Richard?
I think that means you're making very good and productive use of your life, Miguel.
That is
so
true.
much back in there that, most people sat around watching TV, they feel time is flying by.
Hopefully you're right. Yes, I've been very busy. I've had this attitude this year of no excuses because I've spent my life making excuses about projects and spiritual exercises, and I have this attitude of just tackling things as they come. And hopefully that means any project, it's more important than the project itself as the change within you, that you change as an individual. So very insightful, Richard. Very insightful. What about you, Vance? Do you feel time is dilating, warped, or?
Definitely. It happens when there's too much of a routine, same crap in the news, same crap in your life. It just goes, all time compresses according to the events, right? I think that's one of the contributors of it.
All right. Well, you guys let me know what's going on with damn time, Saturn. So, Richard, I wanted to start with anarchism, although I'm going to quote. The first quote will be actually from your second book. I don't even want to say the word, but yeah, we'll go from there. But here you go. One is from the great Adam Curtis, and it's not his last one, Can't Get You Out of My Head, which blew me away. But I'm going to quote Adam. I think he's talking about 9/11 or the aftermath of our wonderful 9/11 event. But he says, in the past, politicians promised to create a better world. They had different ways of achieving this, but their power and authority came from the optimistic visions they offered their people. Those dreams failed, and today people have lost faith in ideologies. Increasingly, politicians are seen simply as managers of public life, but now they have discovered a new role that restores their power and authority. Instead of delivering dreams, politicians now promise to protect us from nightmares. And the second quote, and I know a lot of people always, I think, attribute anarchism to Heath Ledger in The Dark Knight, in a way, mistakenly, partly. But he does say, introduce a little anarchy, upset the established order, and everything becomes chaos. I am an agent of chaos. So you want to speak to these two quotes, or shall we get right into anarchism? You tell us.
No, I can speak to them because they're the opening quotes from both books, right? And the books kind of bookend each other, or they spiral round and meet, because I'd finished The Essence of Anarchy. I put it initially as a series of articles, and I finished that just in the first quarter of 2020. Now, something else happened in the first quarter of 2020. I think we know what it was. So
I wonder what it was. Yeah.
I'd written the anarchism book, and I'd given examples of, okay, this is how this is how it might apply in healthcare, in education, in social welfare. And then this thing happened, and all of that seemed a bit irrelevant all of a sudden, because all anyone wanted to ask us, yeah, but what if there was like a deadly outbreak, right? Well, how do you do that? I mean, that's all nice, we can sort that stuff out, but forget about that. We need to know about the deadly outbreaks. And I was tearing my hair out of this, right? Oh, come on, guy, I I didn't know to put that in. And secondly, just read the principle and you can figure it out, right? If you get the principle, it applies to anything. So I didn't want to answer that question. So no, just do your own work. But then 3 years later, writing, I think I can say this word, measuring the mandates is the name of the book. It's a chance to actually answer that question and to look at, okay, this is where the Adam Curtis quote comes in. So Adam Curtis actually doesn't say what he's talking about there. So he could be talking about anything, right? But he's talking about how the state makes this promise to protect us from dangers. Okay, we might not be able to deliver this dream life that we said we would in terms of economic growth, but without us, you would die of X, Y, Z things. So is that true, right? And what I'm using the quote for is to show that that is a reoccurring pattern. So 20 years ago it was terrorism. Now it's this past 3 years being this new thing, right? But there's this continuous promise. Now, 2 years from now, when the aliens invade, that'll be the thing the state's going to protect us from. Okay, so yeah, this getting beneath that, so this claim that repeats and repeats and repeats, and we kind of fall for it every time, and then there's a shift, right? Because like 60, 70, 80, 90% of people initially fall for it, and then there's a retraction of, oh, actually, I'm not quite sure they're doing such a good job, and some level of normality returns, but not quite the normal there was before. So that's where I was going with that.
No, that's really well said. I always tell people just read some history. It's the old Mark Twain, history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. I mean, nothing new under the sun. This bag of tricks, safety over liberty, whatever, it's been happening forever. I mean, even something like, well, why do we go to war? You can go back to the Roman times. The Romans had this trick. Well, we're not threatened, but they might invade us, so we're going to invade them first. I mean, nothing is original. These things are just happen, and if you see the perspective in history, as you've shown, 9/11 to this, to Ukraine, to the UFOs or whatever they're going to use, a tactical nuclear weapon somewhere in Asia or something like that, or to get us more docile and to make sure that we fall asleep, as they always say. Well word. So, well, tell us about when anarchy start, because even at the Gnosis conference, it was like we were at this party, and there was all this group of scholars and researchers, big guys on the internet, and we're talking about politics, and I said something like, I think we need to just we need to shelve democracy. Good. It had a good run. It's time to just kill it and try something new. And the look of terror on their faces. And I was like, look, you're into the occult. You're supposed to be, open and, going to the edges of reality and see what's happening. And it went down like a lead balloon, and I got into some friendly arguments. So do you get that too, Richard? People think anarchy is the Joker.
It's a hard box to think your way out of. I can relate to this because I remember the first time I read the claim that democracy had become like the new Christianity for us, right? It replaced our religions. And I read that in connection to the invasion of Iraq, because now we went there 1,000 years ago to export Christianity, and now we're going back to export democracy. And I must have been about 20 years old when I heard that claim. And I thought, no, hang on, that doesn't, I can't get my head around that. Democracy is not a religion. It's like a really functional, it is the ultimate functional political system, right? So I can't relate to that. And it took me a long time to climb out of that all-confining box and see democracy as this particular ideology that has taken on all these religious overtones and has replaced our religions in many ways, and voting and all these kind of rituals we go through to get the great gods to shine upon us now. That was a difficult thing to see, so I can certainly relate to it. And I think at the end of the Anarchism book, I don't think I know because I wrote it, so this is case, I quote that lady, Megan Phelps Roper, who left the Westboro Baptist Church. Yeah. Okay, the really kind of the church that would go around abusing people at funerals, essentially. And I quote her kind of process of how she came to see her beliefs were unfalsifiable, because I came to look on the book and anarchism in general as an act of cult deprogramming. Okay, it's about challenging and shattering that mindset. And that's why there's like 100 odd question marks in the book, because I continuously want people like your friends who might, consider the world could be a dream and something, an imagination in the mind of a god, but can't question democracy, to have questions put to them. Well, what about this? And how does that work with that? And if you think this, how can you think that? And challenge until the cult programming falls away.
Yeah, well said. I mean, I always thought democracy or the republic was the best. I mean, I like my life. It's comfortable. I can complain, but life is good. But at the same time, living a lie and realizing that you are suppressed, that you are oppressed, that you live really in a sort of a prison, a political prison, I had to be honest with myself. And it's not like people, I'm sure you're not advocating, Richard, well, we're going to have an anarchist society tomorrow and that's it. I mean, these things can be implemented, and they have been implemented in history. I mean, the example is when you have countries coming together to do trade, it's completely anarchist. There's no body above them. These countries, Japan, China, Indonesia, they just get together and they sort of create. So there are examples. The other one is Tolkien was very interested in anarchism, and the Shire, which many of us think that would be the kind of the paradise world, is kind of anarchist. So, what do you think of this? I mean, it's
Yeah,
not something that we have
I'm not
to.
motivated by a hatred of the world the way it is. There are things that I find morally repugnant, particularly to do with the foreign policy of the countries we live in. Okay, but beyond that, as regards the life I meet as I walk around my day-to-day life, I'm sat here having this conversation with you now on the far side of the world, and people listening in. This is not a bad life. Okay, I'm quite comfortable. I'm warm and dry. What I think is that there are certain principles and reasons that allow this flourishing of life to what we have. And then there's a political system, an archon, if you will, that masquerades and wants to take the credit for that. And they go, hey, look at me, all these great things I gave you. And you can see that. I mean, with any election cycle, but it's going to start in the US in a few months, right? Where you're just going to have wall-to-wall coverage of Biden versus who,
It's never
as if
ended
this is
since the last
important, right? As if this is the thing, and it's so important because if you make the wrong voting choice, that will be all these great things you've got gone. And I think it's an archon masquerading, right, pretending that he gave you all these great things when he didn't. So what I'm interested in really is to identify what was that, right? When I would root it in things like the worth of the individual, that we're not just pawns on a board to be discarded in this way or that way, and rooting it in these kind of ideas. Then you can that's what gives rise to the flourishing of our society the way it has.
Yeah, well said. Yeah. I see in the chat there's already some in the Chatico, there's a troublemaker called some troll called Van Sachi. He's coming with an interesting question, which I think is valid. Uh Vance, do you want to ask, or I can just quote you? The difference
Yeah.
between chaos. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah. What is there a difference between chaos and anarchy? If so, what is it? And or is it just that the former follows the latter? In other words, does chaos ultimately ensue from pure anarchism?
So I started the book with that quote from the Joker to connect with people's common perception of anarchy. And the rest of the book is basically a refutation of it, saying, no, it's not that. The anarchy is order. Anarchy is a higher level of order. And what I wanted to do was strip back anarchy to its essence, very literally what the title says, okay? Because I found when I'd had this discussion with my very state inclined friends over the years, I didn't help myself always by incorporating ideas into anarchy, which were not of the essence of it. And the big one for me was government. That anarchy, if you'd ask people what it meant beyond chaos, they might say, well, it means you get rid of the government, right? And that's not strictly what it means. An archos is without archons. Whatever the archon is, it's to be without that. And that sounds good. So what I propose the archon I'm addressing is that of coercion. And it's coercion masquerading as a benevolent force. So what I do in the book is contrast coercion that doesn't really masquerade in a benevolent manner, and that being like organized crime or the mafia when they run protection rackets. Okay, now they might hand out presents at Christmas or something, but basically everyone knows the mafia is a criminal organization, right? The attempts to disguise that are not that good, and their attitude is more for me and who cares about you, and they're quite naked about that, right? But the state is a compassionate, benevolent form of the same kind of force. Okay, so the policing is still kind of a protection racket, right? If you don't pay for it, there's not like a market choice here. You still have to, they'll be the ones that come and drag you away to a cage. And that's true of all the services the state provides. There's no choice, there's no option, there's no cooperation in them. It's coercion under this veil of compassion, under this veil of selflessness almost. So what I'm proposing with Anarchy is it is simply a movement towards what we already have, where we already have peer-to-peer interactions. Like the people who are signed up to Aeon Byte in the member section are doing it because they get value from that, and Miguel gets value from supporting it. It's not like the British Broadcasting Corporation, where if you don't sign up to them, you don't have a choice. You get abusive letters, and then someone knocks on your door. So that's what I'm proposing a movement towards: is higher level of cooperation and consent.
Well, that sounds good. The question is, though, there are always people who want power for its own sake and want to manipulate themselves into a position of controlling others or getting something from others. And the question is, how do we make sure that the strong don't overcome the weak? Like young people just overrunning, throwing elderly people out of their homes because there's nobody to stop them.
Yeah. So what I'm not proposing, what this isn't, is a solution to all problems. Like the question of how do we stop the strong overcoming the weak is a question that was asked thousands of years ago. It's asked now, and we will be challenged by that 1,000 years to come. It's just an archetypal problem of being human. So what I'm not doing is finding perfect solutions. What I'm doing is contrasting different options. So currently we have this state-based model of security, because in this particular instance, it's a question of security, where you have this one entity that has a monopoly on providing security over a certain area. Now, you can also have some kind of private security, but it must exist under this entity. Okay, and then it provides security from in a different form from surrounding groups. Okay, so I'll just give the example I gave in the book. So this is really an outgrowth of the feudal system, if you think about it, where the lord has his peasants and they give him chickens and pigs, and he provides protection for them. So I give an example. This is somewhat simplified, but in Iceland in the Middle Ages, the lords were not bound to a geographical area. So you could choose which lord provided security for you. And that meant if the lord wasn't doing anything, if he was just taking all your chickens and pigs and giving you nothing in return for it, you had the option to go to a different one. So what I'm really proposing there is a kind of like that's equivalent to a kind of privatized security service, whereby different companies could compete to provide, and then the receiver has a choice in that and has some power over them. So because what you have in the policing systems here, if they don't function, you've got nothing. And I propose that probably the police do more on the whole to increase crime. Right now, that's not me being against any particular police officer or anything like that, but just by the nature of their structures. That just an incident here recently, I know a fellow who was punched in the street, and he went to the police about it, and the police said, well, if you carry this on, we're probably going to prosecute you because you defended yourself. Now, that's a slight shortening of a wider story, right? But there's nothing you can do about that. There's nothing you can do about police officers turning up and arresting people for putting stuff on the internet that they don't like these days. So really it boils down to that there's no system that is made better through monopolization, through having only one provider for it. Everything is made better through pluralism. And in terms of security, nobody really knows the best way to provide security. So like nobody really knows the best way to provide healthcare or education or the best way to podcast. So what you need is pluralism. You need lots of different people competing to provide, cooperating and competing, so they can learn and grow and everything evolves together.
Yeah, I've often thought of that option myself, like you subscribe to different garbage services or subscribe if you don't like the garbage service. And then the next thought I have is, well, aren't the garbage services or the police service going to go to war with each other to try to ace each other out? And then you get kind of on the next level, right?
Well,
like gangs in the cities, exactly what happens.
Yeah. Go ahead, Richard. Sorry.
Well, this question only really comes up with regard to security. Okay, so with regard to garbage, so because we have this whole market system where Coca-Cola and Pepsi might compete, and I'm not saying this because I favor these corporate behemoths who provide this sugary, crappy drink, but they don't usually kill each other, right? You don't have private companies. Like Miguel probably has never got in a punch-up with Alex over at Skeptico or something over, who has the better podcast.
I see him on the street. I
you see him on
will.
maybe it could happen here, but generally, right, there is this our market systems work fine, but when we get into questions of security, it becomes, well, wouldn't they all kill each other? Well, if this were the case, well, you have this anarchy of nations at the moment, right, where security forces cooperate beyond state boundaries. The only way to resolve that would be to have a world government. If you didn't have that, so we're kind of happy enough with it on that level, but there's not necessarily the incentive, because if I'm employing a security firm to look after my property, I'm not employing them to go and like invade some, like the housing estate next door, and steal all their stuff and come back to me with a nice set of like patio furniture or something. That's not a world I want to live in. So the vast majority of people paying for this service are not wanting like a violent uprising. And yeah, so that how's that?
No, that makes sense. Yeah, I mean, human nature is human nature. There is no utopia. Anarchism is not going to solve human nature as it's been. But I feel it's the best one, or at least we should explore. I mean, what did Churchill once said? He said, democracy is a disaster, but it's the best one of all the other ones. Even he knew that as long as we're humans living together, it's always going to be demiurgic, if you would. And yeah, your book certainly quotes a lot of Tony Soprano and his reverse Midas touch. And yeah, all taxation is theft, it's coercion. Like the mafia, our government does not create a damn thing. It just manages and decides to give contracts, whether it's the roads, even the army, it's private companies are behind it. That's all it is. It's just this bad management. And like you said, it is coercion. We don't have a choice. If Biden or Trump wins in the next election, half of the population is basically oppressed. I mean, that's how they're going to feel, because their guy now is out, and the guy they hate is throwing all these rules and Supreme Court judges. So what kind of government is this that every 4 years you're either screwed or not? Same with your city and everything else. So, and as far as the Gnostics, and I don't know if you want to speak to this, Richard, at the Gnosis conference, because I was looking at preparing for our interview, I asked academics like April DeConnick and others, well, and I know the answer, but were the Gnostics anarchists? And they're like 100%. They, again, without archons, they called themselves the generation without the king. They believed in individual rights and not following the law, although you never have records of Gnostics being arrested by the Roman authorities, which is strange. But the one thing that the Gnostics didn't budge on, because they came from the tradition of the Essenes and the Therapeutae and the Pythagoreans, is that that one of their main goals beyond Gnosis was healing. They believed in psychic healing, magical potions to healing on hands. And therefore, they also believed in charity or help for the downtrodden and the poor, which is, you may sound paradoxical, but the Gnostics were like, we don't want a government, but the poor and the hungry have to be taken care of. That's non-negotiable. And they got in trouble with Plotinus, because Plotinus was like, oh, he was going for the government, the chain of being, and the emperor is just an extension of the one, and screw you, Gnostics. Don't worry about the poor. So what do you think of this, Richard? I know you kind of align with that, right? Do you feel that healthcare is a good thing?
Yes, healthcare is a good thing. So as I recall, I write about it in the book as you've got to consider the trade-off, right? That the government can at any moment reach in, socialize healthcare, and then that will increase the provision. But that has massive downstream consequences. Okay, because if you think about the way it's provided and the way research is done, the market and the state models are so substantially different that you're going to get very different long-term outcomes. So I look at the effect, particularly of the FDA in the book, the Food and Drug Administration, when it started heavily regulating the development of new medicines. And this was after the formaldehyde scandal that hit Europe, didn't hit the United States so strongly. So the United States took this as being, well, we did a good job here, so we should like beef this up a bit, and then we won't have this European disaster in the future. But the consequence of introducing coercion is you having a coercive regulatory system. So everyone has to go through this one regulator. There's not a multiplicity of regulators. It means that if you think about the incentives in the FDA, if I work for them, I'm going to get in trouble when I approve a medicine that goes on to hurt people. I'm not going to get in trouble if I kick this medicine back 10 times and keep knocking it back to the manufacturers to improve further. All the people that die through lack of access to it, I don't get in trouble for that. That's unseen, if you like, the seen and the unseen. If costs go up so much that small independent producers of different developments of medicine, if they go out of business and you're only left with like 3 or 4 giant pharmaceutical firms, that I'm not going to get in trouble for that. So by contrast to a consensual model, like you probably want some kind of regulation or someone to test a drug before you stuck it in your body, or any kind of medicine. So, but if there's a multiplicity of providers that you don't have to go for any particular one of them, then there's a tension on them from 2 angles. So on the one hand, the regulating body cannot take forever to put a drug out, or I appreciate people are into holistic medicine, right? I'm just using this as a sort of abstract example. Because if they do, the company producing it is incentivized not to work with them again. But if they put out too soon and it hurts people, then their reputation as a regulator goes down. So you have a tension of forces on there, which produces more of an optimal outcome. So that was my example, really, that with medicine, that people really need to consider the massive consequences of introducing this element of coercion into medicine at all levels.
Exactly, yeah. Like you're saying, anarchism and other avenues or systems are much better for innovation, and we humans, that's how we survive. We innovate our way out of problems, out of disasters, out of hunger. That's what makes us so much different. And if you take away, well, we start dying off. We start becoming dark and breaking down in psychic ways on a collective level. So the other issue in anarchism, and of course you address this in your book, Richard, is that of property. Obviously, and you bring a lot of examples. You bring the example of the guy with the statue. But anyway, tell the audience, how does anarchism deal with property beyond the government telling you what's yours and what isn't?
Well, yeah, I suppose it's a rejection of that idea that you can have property removed from you. Okay, so I think there's kind of 2 pillars, right? There's no coercion, and then there's property. Because if you don't know what property means, you can't really know if you're coercing anyone or not. Like if I just move into someone else's house, I'm like, we need a theory of property, right? So I give an example that really comes from John Locke about a man walking on the beach, and he finds a clump of wood, takes it home, carves it, and then at that point, you probably wouldn't just go into his house and take it. It would feel something like, be very unfair about that, like nicking this guy's statue. But if you saw the lump of wood on the beach half an hour before he did, you probably would feel okay. So some kind of magical act has happened there. But we have this capacity to turn the unowned into the owned, and we commonly agree upon that. And I noticed, like, my dogs have. I just saw it yesterday because I just got a puppy, and the older dog she gave the puppy 2 days grace, and then had to have serious words about going in her dinner bowl. Okay, like that's it. I'm done playing this game, and so they have this very limited sense of property. Like the circumference of this bowl, that's mine. Right? But beyond that, not so much. They couldn't say, like, own a holiday home in the south of France. That wouldn't like, I don't own a holiday home in the south of France, by the way. But just, they couldn't compute what that would mean. But we do. So I just go for examples of that, of what we commonly take to be a legitimate kind of ownership, that we bestow this quality on the unowned. So if I got to the wood and then you came along, Miguel, and wrestled it off me, you'd say, like, well, that's not right. But if I was walking towards it and you charged in front of me, then maybe say, okay, well, that's just competitive. That's kind of okay. Depends what kind of person you are. And so we have this common kind of theme of it, but we also have an exchange, right? So I could sell the statue to you, but the state comes along and says, well, I can take like 10% of that statue as a kind of taxation, and you don't have a say in that then. And so you could say, like, Miguel, if you're like, you could act for benevolent reasons and say, well, that's a real nice statue. I think that would look a lot better if it was on public display. And you take it out, and you can justify that. And you can say, well, look, like before, only Richard is benefiting from his work. But now, like, all these people that walk past it are. So this is like, I'm a really benevolent person here. I'm not an archon. I'm doing this for good
You're
reasons.
an aeon.
Yeah, but the downside is, of course, well, like now, like the cost of that, the unseen cost, is that nobody is secure in their property anymore, because we've all validated like acts of theft, and I'm not incentivized to produce anymore because I'm not going to go get more wood and carve it. So there are these unseen things go on, and that's perhaps like what's intriguing to me about the Gnostic perspective from this, is that there are, of course, like bad and selfish people in the government, but what's interesting is so many people think they're doing a necessary and benevolent thing, and that the state is ultimately a necessary and benevolent entity. So the archons that really scare me more than like the mafia archons of the I'm going to take yours because it's good for me and I don't care about you, is the archon that says, I love you, I'm going to take care of you, I'm just going to take this, you have to go with me on this. That's a much scarier archon to me.
Oh, yeah. The road
Yes.
to hell, good intentions. What do you think, Vance? Does this idea make sense to you about property, or do you have a question for Richard?
Yeah. Well, the real question is like what laws are agreed upon to regulate, whose property is which, and that's like when you sell things, so forth. The definition of property is really the thing that is at issue. So, if I buy a house, but then I'm a bad neighbor and I'm adversely affecting other people, of course they shouldn't take my property. But at some point, like if I start fires and so
Yeah.
they're extreme situations where you can threaten other people by, indirectly by what you're doing on your own property, quote unquote.
I get what you're saying. So this is the one of the reasons that really pushed me to write the book, was struggling with and coming to terms with that question myself, because as I said at the start, I wanted to move away from anarchy as no government, because it's no government in the sense that we currently understand governments, but it's not no governance. Okay, it doesn't mean so that you can't have a rule at the football club that says you can't wear your muddy boots in the changing room anymore, or something like that. You have a governing body of the club that sets rules down. So with regard to that question of property, I gave an example of, like, let's say somebody acquires some land, nobody owns it to start with. They come along and they mix their labor with it, is the term John Locke uses. So in the sense that picking the piece of wood up from the beach, I'm mixing labor with it. That's
Right.
the magic act that makes it mine. And on this land, our owner, builds an apartment block, 100 flats in it. Okay. Now, people might purchase them, they might rent them off him. He might set himself up as the king of the apartment block, but those people are going to want some kind of governing body. They're going to need to know who cleans the internal areas. Okay, how do we put money aside to replace the roof? How do we? No, not every apartment is going to want to get their own window cleaner to put scaffolding up to just clean their window and do the next. There are some activities that you want to be done in a government-like manner. They're just more efficient. But there are some activities like you might collectivize window cleaning, but you're probably not going to collectivize like buying books for the apartment or Netflix subscriptions, because everyone has their own kind of individual tastes on that.
Right.
Okay? And when you collectivize, it becomes restrictive. But who cares about window cleaning? It doesn't matter what company you have in there. So you need some kind of governing body for it, whether it's democratically elected, whether it's a dictatorship run by the guy that built it. But the point is, you can only exert that governance over land that you've come to legitimately own and homestead. This is not like the British Empire arriving on the west coast of Australia and saying everything over the east coast, that's mine now. Yep.
Right.
And that's just the way so it limits the power that that states have, that governments have, to take control of vast areas. And then you have this immense multiplicity arise. So if this developer does set himself up as the king of the apartment block and he does a really bad job, then the property price is going to fall. He's going to go out of business, and other places that do a good job will flourish. Equally, he's incentivized to do a good job because it's his property. It's not like when you have every administration that comes into the US just runs that national debt higher. It's not their property. They're going to make millions of pounds out of it. They're going to get some deal working for the World Bank afterwards or something. So it doesn't matter if they set fire to the country because their wealth increases. So it ties governance into a direct ownership interest in the quality of what they're owning.
Of course, we have homeowners associations. I don't know if you have that where you are, but that are exactly that. they're elected,
Yeah.
they have boards, and they wind up to be archons. You know,
Oh, every time.
yeah, it's human nature.
So I'm not saying that it solves the problem. I'm saying it limits the problem. Okay,
Yeah,
because they're archons, but they're not archons over 10 million acres of land.
it's a
They're
divide
archons
and
over their
conquer.
own little bit.
I like the idea of getting groups of archons fighting each other, and this way they stay out of your hair. That's the way, the American Constitution was supposed to be set up, right? And the two-party system. Of course, then they get together and they said, all right, well, let's not fight each other, let's band together and fight them.
Right.
So, but I agree with your general trend of getting rid of the coercion, getting rid of the monopolies. That's really, getting rid of the concentrations of power, because that's what the archons are all about, right? Concentrating power and lording it over, literally.
Yeah, tyranny cannot exist without centralization. That's just a fact. The less
Yeah.
centralization, the less power the demiurge and the despots have. So that's mathematical. And I like that scene in your book, Richard, where you're talking about Tyrion being in jail and trying to explain property to his jailer because he doesn't have it right there. Could you share with the audience? I forgot how funny that was.
Yeah, Maud, the jailer.
Mord, yes.
Yeah, he's it's in the I think it is in the Game of Thrones book, but it's certainly portrayed in the show where he's Tyrion's in this sky cell, and if he can fall out of it and die, so he decides that enough of this, and he says to Maud the jailer, I'm a Lannister, I'm very rich, and if you go and get a message to the lady of this land, I'll give you gold. And
No.
Maud checks him up and down and no gold, and whacks him with a stick because I don't have it on me. And he has to say to this, property is an abstract concept. And I just used it because it illustrates that it's so obvious to us property is an abstract concept, but we're all a bit like Maud, really. We don't really think, well, what does it mean? Like Maud can't understand it. If it's not on you, then what do you mean you own it?
Okay. Yeah,
But
yeah.
we've developed this idea without really thinking about it, and without really thinking about what happens if we violate it, and what happens if we have an institution right in the center of society that continuously violates it. What are the downstream consequences of that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, even my wife and I were talking again. We're trying to figure out where to move in our destiny. And we're like, well, what does it matter? If we buy the house, we don't really own the house because really the bank owns the house. Let's be realistic. Even if we pay a down payment, they can, let's say we buy the house outright. Well, you have eminent domain. You've got to get there's permits. The government is still inside your damn house that you've paid off. So
Mechanics
of course,
liens.
yeah,
Get your roof
yeah.
fixed, right? And the roofer takes over your
The whole,
house.
the homeowners association can have you kicked out or put a lien on you. I mean, it's like we don't really own our property. So I said, well, I'm going to buy more shotguns and get more guns, and then my wife will end up like Waco. And I'm like, yes. I think that's the natural conclusion of liberty in this country. When it comes down to it, if you are truly free, and don't get me wrong, I mean, the cult was, had some odious ideas, but still, you're going to end up like, you're going to end up in the newspaper or something. It's just the way it is. I mean, when I watch, there's this documentary, Richard, I think it's what's a Wild Country about Osho.
Mm.
And even though Osho was Osho, right? He was doing his weird stuff. But as soon as they bought the land and they set up their own government, they were doomed. The federal government and the FBI had a bullseye on there. Even if it would have been a perfect commune, like well run, no exploitation of people and no Rolls Royces, whatever. The federal government was not going to allow that pocket of freedom in this country. It can't do it.
Mm.
And do you? Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
There was a show in the 90s, I guess it was, Max Headroom, and it portrayed a futuristic society. Great show. I recommend to everybody.
Yeah.
And the only way people could really get out of all this is they became blanks, quote unquote. They had no records, no nothing. They lived in, they were like nomads, and they lived in buses. Like Blank Reg lived in a bus and broadcasted his people's movement from his bus and drived around if they were after him. It seems like anonymity is one of the best ways of escaping the whole thing. But then that's a whole nother lifestyle.
Yeah, indeed. So I get the next question, I guess, Richard, would be examples. And of course, I gave an example of countries practice anarchism all the time when they do trade agreements. As long as the USA and China and Russia can stay out of it, they go fine. But there's of course an example in India. There was some company that uh, brought in all foreigners and everything in India, but they found themselves in like a no man's land where neither of the local governments in India would take responsibility. And so this company and everybody in the company started putting money in. They got their own water, their own housing, their own security. And it went really well. It's one of those examples because it worked. And it had to work because these people were going to die. I mean, no government was going to take care of their needs, from the roads to the water to the plumbing, and they got together. But in your view, have you seen any good examples you want to share of the audience of anarchism that works?
Yeah, well, might not be the answer you're looking for, but I generally say the example is right here and now, all around you. It's when you went out and bought a cup of coffee and you didn't have to punch the guy to get it, and he didn't have to steal your wallet to pay for it. It's when I agree to come on a podcast, we all have a good time. Like we experience anarchy continuously through our lives. So yeah, there are examples. I mean, there's I know there was a guy who set up a place called Lieberland between Serbia and Croatia, I think it was. There was a little strip of land that after the war and the agreements there, nobody had claimed, and he went and moved over there. He had to kayak up a river or something and set up this little property. Now, I don't know how that's going. I know that Honduras had these kind of worker zones because it became a kind of second world country in terms of the technology jobs you had there. So you could earn a reasonable salary and own a mobile phone, but it wasn't like possible to walk down the street using that phone without it being robbed from you. So people set up kind of privately policed communities there. I think the recent elections put a dampener on that. It's very hard to say because I don't know. These things can often have shadow sides to them too. So it's hard to, like you said, with the Osho thing, how these communities go. But I really think the best example is the here and now, the world we experience and enjoy every day, in contrast to interacting with any coercive institution. Like if I wasn't to pay my Netflix fees, I would get some polite emails and then they'd retract the service. When I don't pay the BBC TV license, I get these letters in red telling me someone's going to come around and drag me away to a cage, So that's the contrast, right? You may not like Netflix, right? You might think they're abhorrent and immoral and all the rest. And yeah, you can stop paying, but you can stop paying your subscription. If you don't like the BBC, well, that's tough. You want to watch anything. And this is a UK example, right? So I know Americans,
So
you're not quite,
you have to pay
a license. Yeah, sorry.
You have to pay. You have to pay the license.
If you have a television set in the UK, you have to pay a license to have it. Right? You can't to have it. And I mean, you can own one and keep it in your garage, but if you turn it on and watch TV on it, it doesn't matter if you never watch the British Broadcasting Corporation. You have to pay the British Broadcasting Corporation. Otherwise, they will come around your house and bang on your door and
socialism,
right? You off to jail.
Oh,
the
wow.
government owns the air, and you got to buy it.
Right? Yeah. So it by contrast, America is an example of an anarchist society compared to Britain then in terms of TV, because you don't have that. You don't have to, like, what is it, CBS there. So you don't have to compulsorily pay into this, or you can't watch any of the other channels.
Yeah, for certain. I think the founding fathers were certainly closer to anarchism, or minarchism, as it called. Their original vision of how things are. I mean, there are arguments that it was more oppressive than you think, because I think most people don't know that before the founding fathers and the revolution, the East Coast was like Babylon. Boston, all these cities were just debauched places of drugs and music and prostitution and all that. And it's always like the founding fathers had to come and almost clean it up. So it was a Wild West.
To watch that erosion in the United States, because you don't have a country that's coming out of the depths of time. You have a country that starts at a particular time, and it starts with particular principles, and then you can check in and see how's that going. And particularly post the Civil War through the progressive era, you start to see this redefining as well. Maybe freedom was all very good for the 19th century, but this is a new progressive age now, and we need the state to be more involved. We've got science now, they can make better predictions. Everyone just doing their own thing, it's chaotic, it doesn't work. What we need is centralized planning. And this ideology rises, and it retracts a bit, and it comes forward again, and it comes forward very strongly in Franklin Roosevelt's time, and then Lyndon Johnson pushed it further. And it ties in with this massive expansion of foreign policies. Well, we were going to be isolationists and just keep to ourselves and not go out and run the world, but we just need to do this little thing in Cuba because they're close by, and the Spanish are being really oppressive there. And actually, the European, there's a big thing going on in Europe now. Now we can't let the Germans get away with it. That the Germans are at it again, and now the Vietnamese. And it just expands and expands and expands until it becomes a global empire. So you have this little seed, this almost anarchist state, or very liberal, very classical liberal miniature state, but it has this little seed in it of statism, of coercion, and that seed just grows and grows and grows and grows and grows until it takes over everything.
And here we are indeed. It's there's one example. Well, there's a lot of examples. That's why I like your books, because again, you tie it into Game of Thrones or The Sopranos, like the Feach La Mana from The Sopranos, the famous one with the lawnmowers. And always, I thought it was an intense episode. And of course, like you said, the idiot, of course, easily gets fooled and gets back to jail by Chrissy. But there is the chilling example that I kept thinking about all night. And it reflects our society, what happened in China. And you talk about when Mao came into power, they were like, well, we have only a finite number of grain. Well, guess what? Of course, you got to project your shadow, create a boogeyman. Sparrows eat too much grain. So if we eliminate the sparrows, humans will have more grain. And everybody bought into it, and people were killing sparrows and breaking the eggs and scaring them so they'd get so exhausted and died. And after a while, the whole population was almost extinct, right, of the sparrows. But guess what? The sparrows, they were eating bugs and other insects. So, of course, what happened is it became worse because suddenly you had all these insects destroying the grain, and you had the Chinese, of course, starving. And this is
when you say worse, it's like a lot worse, like 30 million people starved. Yeah. The biggest famine in history. Yeah.
For killing sparrows. And it's this really stupid idea that you have with centralized planning and governments, is that if I add something or if I remove something, it'll fix the problem. Like if I just raise taxes here or cut this sort of really dumb linear thinking that doesn't take into account the complexity of nature, the complexity of humanity, the freedom of humanity. And things just blow. Well, they just get worse. And your Chinese example, I think, is the perfect example, don't you think?
The scary thing is I looked at that for long enough to come to see it as not stupid, right? I could see if you're in
There's a
China
logic.
at that time, right, and you look back through Chinese history, there are these periodic famines. There was a massive one in 1915, and you could think, if we just got rid of those damn sparrows and we made this big, you could see how it made sense, right? And then the problem is, it's not a little experiment you're going to run in your backyard and see if it helps, or you don't do it. No, you've got the power to do it all over China. And this is the problem of benevolence. Like if this was some evil emperor who didn't care whether the poor lived or died, right, then they do a lot better. But when you have someone who tries to be benevolent, and comes in and kills all the sparrows, worst famine in history, created through and I think a genuine effort to be benevolent. Right, that's what's Mao did things later which really weren't genuine, like the whole thing about having everyone stop growing food so they could just produce steel, because that would be, then they built up this great military, or the Cultural Revolution. These were really benevolent acts. These was no care or concern. But what's terrifying is probably the worst thing Mao ever did was like a genuine effort to increase food supplies.
And killed millions of people. Yeah. The Chinese and the Russians, God, those people have been through so much in the last 100 years. You got to feel for them. And it could happen. I think the UK is farther down the road into this sort of collectivism and Borgism, don't you think, Richard? The United States is starting to crumble, but I think the UK is pretty much there, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard for me to see because I'm inside it and I've always been inside it. I think there are things that there are just traditions we don't have here. Like we don't have a strong libertarian tradition. Okay, here, like there are concepts that get spoken about on the American news and such that just wouldn't really make a lot of sense here because we don't think that way. Like when Barack Obama wanted to bring the healthcare thing in about 2009, I'm sat around having lunch with my friends in the pub, and it comes on TV, Americans protesting of like no state-controlled healthcare or whatever, and we all looked at the TV, right, aghast, like who on earth wouldn't want the government to run healthcare? I mean, that's crazy, you know. And it took a few years later for us. Oh yeah, there are actually downsides to the government running healthcare, and they're quite substantial. But like there's very few people here that would ever question that, and that goes across the board. Like no one really thinks, isn't it weird that I have to pay a license to own a television or use a television set? It's more ingrained. I don't think our politics has quite the animosity the US has, and it's not quite the media spectacle. It might be because our prime minister is not a head of state the same way.
Mhm.
Like, these are kind of weird mythical concepts, but the prime minister does not take on the kind of spiritual or mythical significance that a
No.
president takes on in the US mind. We have no John Kennedy figure in this country.
Mhm.
They can be
Yeah,
thrown
that
out more easily there too, right? Prime Minister vote of no confidence, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's can't get rid of the president that easy here. Nope.
Yeah, at the same time, yeah, free speech seems to be less. You can get thrown in jail for social media posts. Although the tabloids in England, they are magnificent at their lying. They're better than the United States when it comes to just blatant lies. When you read some of these magazines, it just cracks me up. How do they get
Yeah.
away with it, Richard? Because yeah, I mean, yeah, how do they get away with it?
Well, they do pay out on libel, I think not
But still,
infrequently, right? They just make more money selling, peddling the papers. Yeah, but I mean, if you ever know anyone who's been featured in the papers, it's interesting to talk to them because they just get everything wrong. They don't. There's no real adherence to honesty, and it's quite incredible. Yeah, the tabloids here, we do see more of that, and I think British people are kind of shocked by this. When people are being arrested for social media posts and so on, I don't think there's a great sort of well of support for this kind of thing. But if you're not reading certain publications, you probably don't even know about it. For one, and it's a strange world we're slipping into. I don't know if we continue down this path or if there's some kind of backlash. Like I have equal concern that the 1930s will be kind of fascist. Actually, it'll be a kind of right wing reaction to what we're seeing now, where all the non-conformists have to go back into the closet.
yeah, that's a problem. It's always the danger. Yeah, you go to one extreme as a way to solve this problem, and you're right back this
Because that's
vicious
typically what
cycle.
happens when the left rises up. Like the times when the left took over, like you could say Russia, China, and Cambodia. It's all coming out of like war-torn states, abject poverty, terror, and all the rest. Any other time that the left has attempted to rise up, it just gets like smacked down. And Jakarta option, you know, that's what happened in Indonesia or Chile or across Latin America, and you end up with some very hard dictatorial governments. So, yeah, that could equally be. Yeah, sorry, I'm taking some
No, no, no,
pessimistic
you're
direction.
right.
Now. We could all move into some wonderful future too. Let's.
I mean, yeah, because I mean, communism and fascism were just reactions to the disaster of the Great Depression. Capitalism really botched things up, so of course these movements were allowed to come up, and then, well, they took over, and then you get the sort of interplay between these forces. It's just the way it is. Vance, any questions from you or the audience?
Yeah, Occult fan has joined us, and he wanted to know, Richard, what's your opinion on the American Revolution? Occult fan states that he's a descendant of the Harrington House in Lexington. So what's your take on the American Revolution, and would you fight if you felt there was a real chance for positive change for you personally?
So I'm going to have to take something of a pass on the American Revolution. I'm doing a history series on my podcast called The Energy Vampire, and I jump into US history in the 1890s. Okay, because it's a good point to jump in because they've just sorted the Indian problem, and now they're going off overseas to look for new enemies. So the Spanish-American War, the conquest of Hawaii. I'm not great on anything before that. Okay, so I've read interesting stuff on the American Revolution. I remember reading on the question of violence, Mark Kozlansky's book "Nonviolence: The History of a Dangerous Idea," where he kind of made a case against the revolution. Yeah, but that's kind of my limit on it. And the second part of the question was, would I fight for if I thought it was going to make a substantial difference? Well, I mean, I'd obviously like, I'm not coming from a pacifist position. Okay, so I think that I suppose this is the question I've kind of wavered on. I've been very attracted to ideas of non-violence in the past, particularly by the book I just mentioned, Kozlansky, and the idea that non-violent movements are by no means perfect, but more effective at bringing down power structures by continuously holding the moral high ground. I suppose maybe through exposure to American gun culture, I've come to question that more and think, okay, well, how far do you take that? Because do you not use force to maintain law and order in society? So I'm sort of conflicted about that myself. Um, I genuinely think efforts that use violence to make the world a better place are corrupting to the soul and ultimately ineffective. So I'm not sort of drawing absolutes there, but that's generally what I conceive of them.
Maybe you could go and steal all the muskets, when they're not looking. That's not violent, right?
Well, it doesn't have to be violent all the time. I mean, look at Poland, look at Romania. Yeah, the dictator got hung, but it was pretty much. There are times, and you could look up history where the people just they move, they take over, and it doesn't have to be people shooting each other. It doesn't have to be
There are
the
very
French
interesting.
Revolution or anything like that. So there are
Yeah, so
examples.
this is the thing, because if I decide to spill blood, okay, I am not the most violent, but might be the least violent, but I'm not the most violent person around. So if I decide to spill blood, there's like 100 other guys who are going to spill a lot more around it. So you can start these things, you don't know where they're going to end. There are like fascinating examples. Again, I'm taking this from Kozlansky's book, Non-Violence: History of a Dangerous Idea, how the people in Denmark protected the Jewish population almost down to a man from the Nazis. They recognized they could not resist in the same manner the French did. So they would engage in go slows, work stoppages, protests.
There you go.
And so essentially set up a negotiation of, okay, well, we will basically function as a society in the way you want us to. And that we only do that, however, if our Jewish population are protected or they're moved out or so on. So they did, yeah, there are very powerful examples of non-violent resistance through
Yeah, I
history.
think
So
also, I don't know if it's the Danish or the Norwegians, but the Germans would have the Jews put on those stars. So the whole population would start wearing those stars to confuse the Nazi soldiers, and the
right, I
Nazis
didn't know
just
that's the
gave
name.
up.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah.
we can't arrest them. We don't know who's Jewish and who's, whatever else. So
There's
there
an
are
immense
ways.
creativity to non-violent solutions, right?
Yeah,
Because I can understand why,
India is
like,
another
you might
example.
initially go to like a punch in the face is the best way to solve this problem. It's probably the first one that comes to anyone's mind, right? Or pick up the gun. But non-violence requires almost a dipping into that creative well of consciousness, right? And the emergence of something more.
Along those lines, what do you think of this concept? I always imagined to get rid of all this, archon like nature in the government. The government should be way more in the business of providing good information to everybody. So as a backdrop to, the independent different businesses, like say you have a whole bunch of coffee companies and one of them starts, putting cancerous ingredients or whatever. Well, if the government couldn't coerce, but could publish all the ingredients, in other words, coerce them to be honest, then we could discover these bad actors among all the different businesses or institutions. And I always thought the government would be that would be a great role for the government, rather than just keeping more and more secrets and protecting powerful corporations from perpetrating things on the population.
Yeah, you could. I mean, I'm sure you can have better or worse in these things. I would also think that surely there's an incentive for some company to compare coffee brands and do this kind of thing. You do find it in, I forget the name of it now, but there is a company that evaluates the efficacy and dangers of drugs independently of the FDA. Or you have in the States, you have something called underwriterless laboratories, right, which stand for
Yes.
electrical goods. And I'm assuming they need to do that to get into department stores, right? The department. It's not just that individual customers are going in and saying, like, "Is this got the UW stamp on it?" That you actually get into, because a department store is incentivized not to sell lamps that are going to set someone's house on fire.
Yeah, the buyers probably would favor the UL. Now there's a CE label, I think, that's kind of overtaken that, but
Right.
yeah.
Here's another issue with anarchism, Richard, and that is the idea of if we don't have the government, nobody will be educated and we'll all just be dragging our knuckles across the street like it. The government is the main source of education. And I love what you said. Basically, obviously, it's a complete lie, it's complete bullshit. And one of your examples is that no matter what people think, going against what people think, medieval peasants could read.
Yeah, I think
Tell
this
us
is
about
interesting.
that.
So this chapter, I think it's the longest one in the book, not by a long way, but it is, and it's the one that I had to pause and take deep breaths as I was writing, okay? Because the other examples I give, like I've never really had a bad experience of government healthcare. The very infrequent times I've gone to the hospital have been really good. I've never been really involved with the social welfare system. I've not been conscripted into war. I've not had a bad experience with the police. However, I, like everyone else, the one we all share, right? We're all like victims of the educational system for a dozen years or so. And
Yeah.
I felt more kind of like righteous anger about this than others, and I had to somewhat keep that in check. But readers will notice it has a different tone than
You
the
were
other more
singing
sort of
Pink
open.
Floyd, Another Brick in the Wall
No,
while you
but
were
yeah, yeah.
writing
Well,
it.
I think I probably went in as a great believer in it. Okay, and then my disillusion, my angst arises from my disillusionment with it. So, yeah, the medieval peasants. I mean, I literally saw this on a YouTube presentation by a medievist about it, fascinatingly interesting, because it's the idea. Like, if the government had a school that taught small kids how to walk, okay, no one would believe that kids learn to walk basically by themselves or just walking around their parents' house. And then you could extend it down to crawling, and then initially breathing. Right, you could have some doctor on site to like massage the chest to get the child back,
Yeah.
and we were just removed from this sense. But it's one of those things that when you think about it, it's so self-evidently true. It's like, well, hang on, imagine like the value that reading conveys, okay, or being able to write, being able to communicate through some kind of like, whether you're scratching things in bark or however you're doing it, it's immense, right? And what do you need to do? You basically need to be able to remember like 26 characters and their associated sounds, and you need to sort of get it roughly right, and then you can sort of arrange them in a way that makes sense. And if you consider like the average Englishman like knows the position at any given time of 20 different football teams in the league, and not just now, but they can tell you like where they were in 1987 and what goals they scored when they played in the FA Cup semi-final in 1994 and so on. The idea that like people would find this incredibly overwhelmingly difficult without some sort of state stepping in. So apparently what it is why we think peasants were illiterate is because to be literate in the past meant to be able to read Latin, and they couldn't read Latin, okay, but they could. They were literate in the sense that we mean literate, or at least a much greater percentage of them were than we think. So it just speaks to people. Obviously, if education is valuable, people move to educate themselves. Yes.
Yeah, it's an old trick. I mean, in ancient times, Greco-Roman times, you talk about the barbarians, and again, we think of Conan and these again knuckle draggers, but a barbarian was just somebody who didn't speak Greek. Of course, there were educated societies like Egypt and Persia, and some of the Germanic tribes. But again, it's this continuous mind control, and yeah, I mean, the education system is a complete disaster. My 11-year-old daughter, she's homeschooled, and my wife did a test on her about a month ago. She's reading at a college level, and it's not much more work. It's just better education. Let kids, they have all the tools and they have all the potential, like breathing and walking. So it's much better than this by rote or memorization system we have today that actually destroys the mind of children.
I think it brings up the like beneath this act of benevolence that the archon of the state, the archon
Right.
of education puts out, there's a kind of intense rage when that's rejected. So I put in examples of like from the UK media of like the police turning up at kids' homes and dragging them out of their beds in the morning to go to
Oh my God.
school. And it's like, well, this is because the state thinks it's done this wonderfully benevolent thing. It's taken all this money off the populace to provide education for children. They get a free education. And when that's rejected, that benevolence turns to a kind of infantile rage that it's been rejected. And you just get to this crazy position. So you're going to drag someone out of their bed into this building so they could be taught Shakespeare. Like, how's that going to work? That's not going to work, right? And like I just remember sitting on the school bus myself with kids like after like coming out of their exams, tearing their poetry books up, and Wordsworth flying through the air in one direction and Blake going in the other, and because they didn't care, right? They just wanted to get out and become plumbers and joiners and mechanics, and I see them years later, and they're very successful plumbers and joiners and mechanics, right? But like the idea that a 15-year-old is going to be really interested in 19th century poetry, and what
I
planet are we on here?
was, yeah, but that was me. I was different. Everybody's different. I remember being
Yes,
10 years old and
no,
reading
absolutely.
Tiger, Tiger by Blake and saying, "This is me." But that doesn't mean the kid next to me had the same skills. He was interested in plumbing mechanics. So
I did have this dark thought, right, that what this is all about is that when the educated classes, when a plumber comes to their house, they want them to have had the schooling experience so they know their place. It's right. So like, yeah, remember when you weren't good at Wordsworth? Yes. Like my dark kind of thought about it.
yeah, yeah, indeed. And of course, yeah, and of course it was so stupid because I'm sure all of us agree it'd be like a summer holiday. And by the fall, we'd go back. It's like, I don't remember a damn thing I learned last year. Most of us, it's like we just memory dumped all our stuff, except what we wanted, read. We can still read and stuff, but it was all
Yeah,
just a big waste of
you,
time.
you just have to move on in a second. I'll just talk about this all the time, but I'm going to see my friend after this. And to this day, we still laugh about the 3 months we spent studying Levi's jeans commercials from the 1980s. I mean, like, they're not. What was that about, right? Because it's supposed to be this deeper lesson, but it wasn't. We were just literally writing down what happened in it. And I mean, if you can have you back on the show if you want to talk about Levi's jeans commercials in the 1980s, because I know quite a lot about it. But I don't know why I know anything about it. It's just this bizarre, like they have to fill the ear with something. so yeah, it's amusing and
Levi's,
frustrating.
because we're here. We exist.
Oh, Lord.
One of the problems though with the educational system is, like nothing in this world is easy. When you think about the higher education progress of society in general, like what enabled us to invent things and make industry and blah blah blah, assuming you think that's good, which not everybody does, it may be that it's not self-sustaining if only the interested people went on beyond reading and reading and arithmetic. There might not be enough people left to go further to support the educational institution, so they have to drag everybody in, drag everybody else, so there's enough people to pay for it all.
You mean in the sense it becomes a self-sustaining bureaucracy, the giant university system? Yeah, they need to fill it now.
Yeah. Just like in this country right now, I'm getting the impression that American universities can't survive without importing a lot of students from overseas, because there's just not enough people that are interested in this country, or either that or the institutions, the colleges and universities became too big.
Well, I think that's another huge problem with the state, that you do create these self-sustaining bureaucracies. So whatever other explanations we have for the goings on in the world of like conspiratorial or whatever else, a part of it is just people have to okay, so I think part of the reason we had the first Gulf War back in the 90s is because this giant central command was created to stop the Russians coming down into Persia and taking all the oil. And then the Soviet Union broke up, and well, what do we do with that? We're all going to have to find new jobs in the private sector, or we could have a war in Iraq. Now, it just seems like that would be a better option at this point. Yeah.
Right.
We'll replace the communists with the evil Muslims. And then,
because when you're being paid by the taxpayer and it's not really voluntary, then you have that option.
Yep. There's an archetypical pattern. Absolutely.
Oh, Lord. Well, why don't we discuss a little bit your book, Measuring Mandates, because it does, like you said, it does relate, and it does talk about the failure of a centralized, we only want what's good for you kind of system that has basically changed the course of history in Western society, probably forever. And we are in this sort of brave new world. And for the audience, Richard has plenty of statistics and graphs, and he asks a lot of questions for you to consider. You're not really judging. You're just trying to tell people, well, look at this, and what are we going to do about it? But probably better tell the audience about the book.
Okay, so I think we all understand, the audience understand, that I have to be careful in the way I talk about this.
Keywords, yeah.
Code and language involving carrots and all sorts of words that don't mean what they mean, because we just get booted off certain social media platforms otherwise. So measuring the mandates was really, well, it was, for me, it was cathartic, okay? Because this thing happened over 3 years where the world went kind of insane, and we were suddenly being told, you need to do this, 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 and this, and everything you need to do changed, often reversed. Whatever it was last week wasn't necessarily what it was this week, but it was always essential that you did it or everyone was going to die. And then you're going to kill Granny, whatever. So it was a chance to look back and go, okay, it's kind of quietening down now. So was any of that true? Any of it? And give the short answer is, my short answer is no. Right. So it was actually written. I put it as part of a group here that were concerned about the mandates in our local area for submission to. We submitted it to an inquiry looking into the government's handling of it, and then I took out the references to my particular geographical area and made a kind of international version of it. So I go through looking at the different aspects of it, from the things you had to put on your faces. Was that justified? Where did that come from? To the idea that we all need to stay at home. Where did that arise from? Doesn't seem to be an idea before that. Can you see it successful at all? Is there any demonstration of that? Do you see mountains of corpses piling up in the countries that didn't do it, or is there no distinction at all? To where this thing came from initially, to the kind of origin stories, which seem to be shrouded in mythology to me, and yeah, very, very difficult to understand. To the thing that I was calling a carrot, that like it was absolutely essential you took, and the hospitals were just full of people that didn't take them, apparently, or unless they weren't. And then I think probably the most original chapter in it is the first one, actually, on iatrogenic deaths, doctor-induced deaths. Okay, and did you spot the image on the cover, Miguel? I said there was a little Gnostic image on the cover.
It did, but what am I missing?
So the cover is composed of all these different images of the past few years of British state propaganda about it and all the rest. And I wrote a little article right at the start of this period called Conjuring the Thing, right? Conjuring the name of the thing. I won't say. And I used an image from Hieronymus Bosch's painting. It might be a student
I
of Bosch,
noticed that.
Bosch,
Yes.
the Conjurer, right? So
yeah.
And I replaced. So it's the Conjurer is doing his cup and ball trick. Where you have 3 cups and the ball's under one, and he's moving them around, and you do a sleight of hand, and then you have the dupe there in the audience who's really leaning forward, getting drawn into this. And as he's doing it, someone's picking his pocket. So interpreted esoterically, you could say that there's something about the material world. The conjurer is the magician who sets up a consciousness dropping into, being absorbed into material, forgetting its true identity, and having something taken from it in that. And I replaced the balls with little images of the thing, right? And my suggestion was that okay, this might be a real thing. The death rates are spiking across the world, sure, but if we only pay attention to that, then we'll destroy our economies, we'll lose our civil liberties, this bad thing, and you can't allow your attention to be narrowly absorbed. And then about a year later, I realized that I was the dupe in this, that I'd actually been taken in by the statistics and the graphs and believing that this thing was going around doing all the killing. And I came to, and this might be controversial, this might not entirely agree, but this is what I made the case for. I came to see that what I'd lost through my own kind of fear reaction, my own kind of like, oh my God, this is happening reaction, was that when you start making changes in a complex system, the whole system moves to respond. So if you announce this thing is on its way, this beast is coming in from the east, this monster that's going to kill us all, medical systems react, they change, they kick all the old people out of hospital. They don't let any old people from care homes in the hospital. This is an Amnesty International report about the UK I'm quoting here. They say, well, if people have this deadly thing, then they're obviously going to die. There's no point in keeping them around. So get them on the end of life drugs early. Don't give them food and water because they're not coming back from this. We know how deadly it is. It's got like a 3% death rate. And changes in and of themselves affect death rate. And the changes, I make the case, are a better explanation of the spiking death rate than the thing that's supposed to be spiking the death rate. So the book is really an assessment of the state makes its promise. It used to make its promise in the age of terrorism that it will protect us from the bad Muslim men, and now it's protecting us in this new bad thing. Does that check out? And the answer is no. All the things it did, there's no evidence it worked. There is evidence it probably made things worse. And perhaps unlike 9/11, because I believe that there were actual terrorists. There is an organization called Al Qaeda, and it all gets
Mhm,
more murky there as they intertwine with intelligence agencies. But I think there is something there. Um,
mhm.
Unlike that, the deaths themselves in this case are actually caused by the state itself.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. For the audience, you have to read the book. Yeah. And Richard really takes some, he deals more with excess deaths than all these stupid charts that you would see during the situation. So you get a better view. And of course, I mean, without a doubt, things like ventilators, and that's the government admits did more damage than good. A lot of the new drugs, and of course, the common sense thing. There's that famous scene where during the close downs, there's this kid surfing in a California ocean, and all these cops are converging to arrest him and throw him back and take him to jail. And this happened in Australia and other places. And like fresh air, sunlight, going out, a good mental state, all these things were just imperative. So there was a lot of mistakes that were so obvious from the start, including, and it caused a lot of pain. So the question, of course, Richard, is again, are we talking about evil or the road to hell with good intentions?
Right. So I'm very open to there being evil in there, and there are certain actors who I find it impossible to think could be honest in this. There are certain like mafia figures, right, who may or
Tony
may not be Italian
Soprano.
American, in particular, um, right? Who I so why do we play the evil card? Right? We play the evil. We say that person's evil when we cannot understand their actions. And I think in a lot of instances we're too early to play the evil card, because what it really means is I'm incapable of understanding how this person has a different perspective and how from their perspective what they're doing
Right.
is good. Obviously that has a limit, right? Obviously some people are just evil, self-interested, prepared to go out and lie, don't care about killing large numbers of people if it's to their own advantage. Okay. Um, so there is obviously an evil card on the table here. Okay. But it doesn't scare me as much as the good card that's on the table, because the vast majority of people involved in this believed they were being virtuous. Okay. So, like, I'm sure there probably were in the European witch trials, there probably were some evil witches that got burnt. There probably were some people who were really trying to put hexes on their neighbors. Okay. But those people aren't as scary as the psychotic mass of people that are around the burning pyre cheering the whole event on for the vast majority. So there's good and there's evil, but good scares me more than evil.
Yeah, it's like in the Soviet Union, people who turned in their neighbors, or Nazi Germany, people who turned in secret Jews. You know, they thought they were doing something good for the state, and what they were doing is sending people to their deaths. And like you said, it made no sense. You had a problem that arose in China, and the solution was to adopt the same coercive methods that China did to solve their problem, which never got solved, and the whole world adopted it, and things just really broke down. I think, and I'm sure it was different because in the UK, because here in the United States, Richard, when you had 50 states and the governments had to make their calls on all 50 straight states, it was a mess. No governor followed the other governor or followed the CDC, and different governors would reopen a month later and another government would do this. So it was pretty chaotic, and that's how Americans like it, I suppose. Obviously, the George Floyd death kind of threw everything out, because suddenly everybody's like, okay, are we in a crisis? Are we not in a crisis? Um,
It's actually very helpful chaos if you're studying the event now, because the level of global uniformity is kind of terrifying, right? Just how an ideology can so take over or be imposed, and what the United States does, because inside one country there's like more disparate positions than probably across Europe. Okay,
uh,
so what that allows for is comparison to be made, and it's not an easy comparison actually, because it's so wild. Like a state could have a stay-at-home order, or another one could close businesses down, or some could do it very harshly for like 2 weeks and
yeah,
then be quite liberal over that. But if you convert to proxies like economic activity over time and control for factors like tourism and so on, you can do a comparison between states and say, okay, looking at the severity of how they did the close downs as compared to lives saved, and what you get is a big mess. You don't get any sort of like, which is what you would want to see, because it's clear that the close downs had massive negatives, okay, in terms negatives that we're going to see for a long time into the future. We're seeing them now in terms of the rampant inflation in this country. So for them to be justified, you'd need to balance that out with like massive positives, and that would mean that anywhere that didn't do them, you would need to see like dead bodies in the streets. You need to say,
Like
oh, this place, they didn't do it, and they
Sweden,
just
yeah,
okay. Yeah, Sweden.
Sweden
So
wiped off the map, and
you would, yeah,
Florida
and
full
Sweden
of
did.
dead bodies, or
Sweden
something
did
that you
about
say,
the best in Europe.
we know
Yeah,
this was, yeah.
because there's I opened that chapter with a CNN headline of a death soar in country that didn't close down. Well,
And
one,
even
they don't mention
Trump,
the death soar
yeah,
in countries that did.
Trump publicly castigated Sweden too.
Yeah,
Everybody hated Sweden during those days,
if
but they
Sweden
are
hadn't taken that
objectively a
course, we would
success
have no
story.
basis of comparison in Europe now.
Mhm.
Which I think is what they wanted, right? I don't think they wanted a control group, because
No,
that's
which
going to show
of
them
course
off.
made sense. Yeah. Well, of course they were going to ignore all the African countries, because God forbid the West acknowledge that Africa is a place. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because it had to be European. Freaking ridiculous. Yeah, I highly advise the audience to read it, make up your mind, contact Richard. It's a short read, same as with Essence of Anarchism, and there's so many good statistics, insights, and as we're seeing, anecdotes, historical and otherwise. Vance, as we start getting to the end, do you have any questions for the audience?
Don't see any questions in the audience. We had Occult Fan earlier. The greater good, these benevolent people, got to watch out for them. But no, that's all we got, I think. There was a question as far as whether you had a podcast, but I think Miguel will cover that in the places we can get your material.
Yeah. Well, while we're here, what is your podcast and website? So let's get that out of the way at least.
I'll just mention the website is deepstateconsciousness.com. Now, the Measuring the Mandates book, I've made that freely available, right? You can download it from there. If you want it, get it from Amazon. It's on there for about $2 or something. But I really just want to get this out there and have people look and see what they agree with me about this, and come to question the whole thing. And deepstateconscious.com has my other writing on books on anarchism and some on spirituality and consciousness. Obviously, be let down if that wasn't there. And podcast, yeah, I do have a podcast. It's called the Deep State Conscious Podcast. You can get it from the website. And on there, I'm doing a variety of different things. So I look at the line between what we might take to be sensible history and where that tips over to conspiracy. So I'm doing a series on the moon landings at the moment, and how people see them so differently. I'm doing what might be a kind of long history of how we got to the lockdowns, the shutdowns, starting in the 1890s. So I'm going through this rise of imperialism and how we've come to look at step into an ever more centralized world. I'm currently looking at the kind of revisionist claims of the Russian Revolution on there, the famously associated with Anthony Sutton and so on. And I will be doing more stuff in this kind of questions of consciousness and archons and so on too. So that's where I'm at.
Awesome. Yeah, it's right there. Deep State Consciousness should be a good one. And how did historically, I mean, I've read how historically people did ancient history, because that's my thing, in Greco-Roman times and earlier. And yeah, it was they used a lot of magic, but whether it was the Byzantine Empire or the Roman Empire, it was always a pruning, and it always had it was always devastating. It was the way of the world. But have you gotten to the Spanish flu? How did people deal with that one?
Oh, well, I'm being a bit circuitous, right? So I'm not looking, it's not really a medical history, it's more of an imperialist history. Okay. So it's centered around US foreign policy, although in season 2, I've had to jump over and look at the First World War. So what I'm trying to demonstrate really is where these international institutions arose from. Like whereas you have in the second half of the 20th century, the US coming to dominate a large chunk of the world through overthrowing governments and putting compliant dictators in place. And you also have the rise of these globalist institutions like the World Health Organization and so on. I mean, the Spanish flu is an interesting one. I strongly suspect you'd find something similar if you looked there, that the interventions somewhere along the way brought that about.
But sometimes that's the thing. Sometimes the government doesn't do shit. I mean, I remember being a teacher in a public education in the South Side during the whole bird flu thing, and Obama administration was freaking out. And basically, I would go teach, and some people wore masks, some didn't. Nobody really paid attention, and you start noticing. Did you know during Woodstock there was a big pandemic? It wasn't as big as this, but it was an emergency. I think it killed between 100 and 200,000 Americans, but nobody changed their lifestyle. I mean, people were going to Woodstock in the summer, and it was just the government just had an attitude where, deal with it, take it on the chin.
Yeah, and that might be why you didn't see massive spikes in the death rate.
Yeah,
Might not just be because it wasn't as dangerous. It might be because the government wasn't as dangerous.
One thing is the demographics are much different now because of the baby boomers. There's a huge bubble of older people that is now was more at risk from the disease. I think that's that thing that pushed us over.
Yeah, and the crappy health of Americans. I mean, when you look at, let's say, the Japanese and other nations that are with less help, they barely had any issues. I mean,
you do find
again, our government has done a great job at poisoning the population.
You do find that correlation that the less healthy the state, the higher the mortality rate, unsurprisingly. But what you also find is that people were denied antibiotics during that period. There's a massive
that's ongoing. Oh yeah, they're afraid of it. They don't want to give antibiotics anymore. Yeah, they're afraid of resistance and bacteria mutating so that we don't have any antibiotics anymore. In which case, take them all away and you're in the same place, right?
Well, that's it. Yeah, when I lived in Texas, doctors would give antibiotics like candy. And when I moved to Chicago, doctors were so resistant for those reasons. The doctor was like, just because you've got a little cold, I'm not going to give you antibiotics to your children. It had to be, you basically had to push back, or it had to be an emergency. So I thought it was interesting. Even in the United States, it's a bit regional, this sort of attitude.
Yep.
All right. Well, I think we got your podcast. We've got your website. We got everything else. Any last thing you want to tell the audience about how to find your books or your work, Richard?
It's all on Deep State Consciousness. Yeah, they go there. That's the central kind of hub.
Centralized.
You can even read my poetry. Now, how about that?
Oh, there you go. There you go. What kind of poetry is it?
I do a fair bit of metaphysical poetry, poems on empire, which is just, that's when I just get so annoyed with something that's going on. I just have to splat that one on the page. Metaphysical poetry is all about the materialism, idealism debate and how we can switch between those perspectives. And a fair few poems like reflecting on spirituality. So like poems on Zen, not Zen poems, but poems that look at incidents like from the lives of Zen masters or like Christian theological positions, and just try and take a different perspective. It's like, what if you were standing over there in the room? How would this appear then? So yeah, just things that I suppose, having been very interested in these things for a long time, I came to reflect on them. Like, oh yeah, well, how can you consider these things differently?
Yeah, very cool. Well, check it out, people. Of course, I'll have it on the show notes. I'll have a link after this. And of course, this interview probably tomorrow. I will release the audio version on all podcast providers. And so it will get, we'll get good traction as long as certain archons don't listen to this, but I think we've disguised it well. So I really appreciate those of you in the audience. I know we're pretty much starting the holiday weekend, and hopefully you guys want to be out getting some sunlight, touching grass, being out there with, Artemis. For me, Artemis is the goddess of the summer, so I am definitely communing with her. So, Vance, thank you very much for keeping us company and keeping the Chatico under control.
Yeah, they were great today, and it was great hearing you, Richard. Definitely a more subtle message than people would think if they just heard the word anarchism. You get good fine points on it.
The term has been weaponized, like conspiracy theorists and you know how it is. So we think of the Sex Pistols or the Heath Ledger when you hear anarchist or something.
Riots
like that. And Bart Simpson or something like that. Well, Richard, as always, it's been a pleasure having you on the podcast. And as always, we look forward to the next time we can chat.
Thank you very much. It's a real delight to come on here. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone. Again, have a good weekend. And as I always say, write your own gospel, live your own myth, and live a life without archons. Take care, everybody.